I'm just going to tell you a quick dream that we were given this week, actually, or last week, by somebody, which illustrates some of the things Joe was talking about, including repetitive dreams. A woman said that, you know, she's been getting this repetitive dream lately, and she's involved in trying to hide away from the Norman invasion. And there's all these soldiers, these French Norman soldiers, firing arrows at her, and she's trying to hide and dodge them. And then she said, I just didn't know what it was about. Why was I going back into the Middle Ages and having this dream? And then she suddenly twigged what it was. There's this chap has been making approaches to her who she really doesn't want, you know, but he keeps making approaches to her, and his name's Norman. And this has been going on for some months, you know, and every time she gets worked up about it, she has this dream. We're going to do a little bit of time travel now, and look at, go right back to why is it that now we can talk about dreams? Because as far as we know, cats and dogs and cows and sheep don't talk about their dreams, but we can talk about our dreams. We came into this world, we're part of the hominid group of creatures who appeared on the planet about 6.5 million years ago, a long time ago. And there's a huge, huge mystery. Is how do we get from that to this? What's the difference? You know?
That's an elephant seal.
So we're going to look at our ancestors, and very, very quickly, because there's some other things we want to talk about, but just to remind you, and some of you know all this stuff, but I'm just going to summarise it very quickly. So we had these common ancestor apes, and they seem to have appeared about 6.5 million years ago. And then there was a type of human being called handyman. He's often referred to, but Homo habilis. He's obviously using his hands a lot, and he appeared 2.5 million years ago. Sometimes he's been spotted in B&Q, so he must still survive. But he had a brain size half the size as modern man. But he did use these broken stones as tools, and we can imagine he was also using sticks and other things that he found. Then there was another type of human known as Homo erectus. He appeared about 1.5 million years ago, and he had a much larger brain, about 80% of the size of our brain. And he was using more sophisticated tools. They can date the tools around the bones, and they get quite accurate information about these things. And it's speculation that he was using more complex language. The muscles in the bone structure in the throat and the jaw and so on suggested that he had a wider range of sounds he could make. And he was found hugely across Asia and Africa. Then we had Neanderthals, and you've all heard of Neanderthals. They appeared a little bit before, roughly the same age as modern man, but maybe a bit before as well. And they only disappeared about 28,000 years ago. And in fact, we, modern humans today, contain a little bit of Neanderthal DNA in them. So there was probably some breeding between Neanderthals and modern human beings. Now that's a Neanderthal skull, and you can quite clearly see the huge ridge bones and so on. And the speculation is that they evolved to live in extreme cold conditions, and that's why they have these chunky skulls, and they were very, very strong. They had big, beefy legs and a frame, you know, they were stocky. Now, I've only been able to find one photograph of Neanderthals. It's the only known photograph of a Neanderthal. But I'll give it to you there, the old Victorian photograph. Now, us, Cro-Magnon man, appeared about the same time or a little after. The earliest skulls of modern humans have been found in Ethiopia, and they're about 200,000 years old. Some textbooks say we appeared about 130,000, 140,000 years ago, but that's been pushed back further by these new discoveries. And for a long time we lived on alongside Neanderthal man. There's been bones of Neanderthals and modern humans found in the same caves. So they were obviously, Neanderthals were in the cave, people would move and then they'd go, and then modern humans would come in. So you get these different layers of remains from the two types of humans. Particularly in the Middle East, in Israel, there's some famous sites where that's occurred. And they used similar stone tools. You can't really tell the tools of a Neanderthal as any different from the tools of a modern human. We've read in several books that Neanderthal children appear to grow up much faster. So a Neanderthal sort of 10-year-old would be equivalent to, say, a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old modern human. And the types of tools that Neanderthals and modern humans used prior to about 40,000 years ago were cutting tools, stabbing tools, scraping tools, but more or less like that. That was how they were. And then something very strange happened. We appeared, and we know what we look like because we're all around us. And about 40,000, 37,000 years ago, somewhere in that region, there was a huge cultural leap. Art suddenly appeared. There was a beautiful exhibition in London recently of cave art and found carvings and so on. It's absolutely stunning to look at these things. But there didn't seem to be much of an evolution. There's a few little indications of decoration and so on going back sort of 70, 80,000 years ago. But there was an explosion of creativity about roughly 40,000 years ago, which we've called, and other people have called, the brain's Big Bang. Something happened. And you get these carved figures carved out of mammoth ivory, for example, beautiful ones. There's an explosion of tool culture. The tools suddenly became much more complex and more beautifully designed. And I don't know, some of you have been to the south of France, for example, or in Spain, and other parts of the world, but mainly in France. There's a massive amount of caves, and they're discovering new ones all the time, with cave paintings going back an awful long time. And I've been to a number of those, and it is a wonderful experience. But some of them are a couple of miles underground. Isn't that strange? Why would they go so far underground and create these cave paintings? We think that, if you think about it, as animals, we were constantly on the alert for sounds. We were living in the moment. Animals live in the moment. They don't have a past or a future tense. They live in the moment. They're responding to signals, to noises and stimuli from the environment, the wind, the rain and everything else, the threats. To actually develop the imaginative faculty, you need peace and quiet. You need to be able to cut out extraneous interventions. And it could be that when human beings made this change, there were some human beings who'd made it quicker than others that were trying to bring other human beings on. No, you must see what we're doing, you know. And to get away from all the distractions, they went into caves, deep into caves. And at that same time, about 38,000 years ago, suddenly you see, instead of those crude chopping and stabbing and scraping stones, much more refined tools being made, some of which are really, really quite beautiful. And 28,000 years ago, there was some groups of burials where they found, I don't know if you can see it on there, but you see all those beads and round the head as well. They were carved out of ivory, and there were hundreds and hundreds on each of these figures. Woven, obviously, were once woven into leather, or some material. And when they've tried to recreate that in modern times, they take about an hour each to make. So if you've got thousands of them in a burial site of several bodies, thousands of these things, that's thousands of hours worth of labour, fiddly labour, to get to the point where you could decorate somebody in them. And 26,000 years ago, the stone tools had developed. I mean, these are lovely sort of works of art, really. And they're so sharp today, 26,000 years later, you could shave yourself with them. They really are incredibly sharp. And from the same time, they also made these needles. And they were clearly using them and understood the principle that needles had been invented and were being widely used. There's a lot of them. And in the underground caves, get back to those, you see the early signs. They call this fluting, which is basically there'd be wet clay on the walls, and men, women and children, because they can see little ones, obviously children were doing this, were making patterns and waves and so on and shapes in the clay. And then of course they just sort of get harder and harder and they stay there, and we've discovered them. And you can see some of the early drawings seem to have been a mixture of that and drawing with hands, fingers and sticks and so on. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, there's some very interesting conclusions you can make from looking at these things. Have you noticed that a lot of these drawings are on top of one another? That was one of the things, one of the first caves I went into. You go on this tunnel, into this tunnel on a train, long underground, and then the train stops and you all get off. And they say, and these are all this is the Mammoth Cave or something. And you look up and you can't really make out, well, it's just lots of scratches. And it takes ages for you to realise that this is actually one of the famous caves that appears in all the books, the textbooks about ancient art. And all the drawings are on top of one another. So, like that. You see, there are mammoths there, but at first, especially, this is a kind of a drawing copy of one of these ceilings. And you can see there's buffalo and mammoths and all sorts of things in there, and horses. There's also a sort of shaman figure here, which they think is a shamanistic image. It's very odd, because we don't do that now. You don't sort of draw something and then draw over it, and then draw over it, and draw over it. To such an extent that it's hard to make out what the drawings are. But that was going on then. That is a drawing of a 3-year-old autistic child. Drawing on top of one another, drawing on top of drawing on top of drawing. Almost little cartoons of horses. This girl apparently was obsessed with horses. And there's one she did at 3 years, 5 months old. And I bet you that some of you here couldn't draw quite as well as that. You know, just, she loved fairground horses and she loved real horses and she was drawing them. How similar that is to drawings in Lascaux, which they have the same kind of freedom, but also they're drawing on top of one another. There's an old drawing of a mammoth, and this is a girl's, the autistic girl's, it might be another girl, but you can see there, she's been to the zoo and she sees this elephant. Can you see that there's an elephant here coming towards you, which is a sophisticated thing to do anyway at 4 years old. There's also another bigger elephant there in the background, and she's captured in that drawing, I think, almost the essence of elephanthood, you know what I mean, just in a few lines. And you go into these caves and you see similar sorts of images. There she is again. She's got her face looking towards you, and she's got horses, and she doesn't mind drawing on top of her other drawings at all. It's irrelevant. For her, the process is in the moment. There's a translation of what she's seen and onto something, and then she moves into the next one, and she's not interested in preserving what she's done or anything like that. And that's a drawing she did when she was, when does it say? I don't know, 5 years old, I think. It's she went to see a hunt, you know, all that sort of, a fox and everything. And that was the result. It's a very dynamic drawing. This is this girl's drawing. Nadia, her name is. She's sort of known as an autistic savant. That's her drawing. That's Leonardo's drawing, and that's the average 8-year-old. And she did this when she was 5 years old. And in some ways, it's more dynamic than Leonardo's drawing. This is interesting, isn't it? Where am I going with this? Well, do you remember I pointed out there's a shamanistic figure, composite figure, and they've seen those in a number of caves, and they tend to say, oh, this is a shamanistic, a magician or something from those times. But spontaneously, some young autistic artists produced composite animals. And there's a famous one from one of the caves, I can't remember which cave, in France. There's the image, and that's how it's been, someone's copied it and drawn it. You can quite clearly see there's several different animals there. There's kind of like a human or monkey face. There's reindeer horns. There's elements of several different animals there anyway. I've been to that cave as well, and it's called Peshmerga, where the artists, they saw the shape of the horse's head in the rock, so they kind of filled it out. Can you see that shape there? And another thing that in that cave, there's all sorts of these handprints. They blow paint on, put their hands up against, and then blow paint onto it, and then you get a negative image coming up. I think that's Lascaux. That's the Chevet cave in the Ardèche region, which 32,000 years old, twice as old as the Lascaux, famous Lascaux paintings. And actually, you can't see it there very well, but those paintings are better than the ones in Lascaux, yet they came 32,000 years ago. It's absolutely amazing. I promise you, you'd be very pleased to be able to draw as well as those artists were doing back then. There's two bulls from Lascaux. They've got, when you actually see them, which I have, they seem to be charging towards you, which is, they're huge. They're really full size. And that's from Spain. It's a bull, but it's almost like a Chinese painting of a bull, the way it's done. So, what was going on? Well, what we realise is that the REM state is important in the animal kingdom. As Joe was saying this morning, as your questions revealed, we were creatures living in the now, as all animals and birds do. They're responding to weather, to their innate needs to, for example, sleep, eat, drink, mate, all those things, protect themselves, flee when they need to, fight when they need to. They're doing all that, but they're doing it in the moment. We don't do that. We've escaped the moment. But to do that, we had to be able to access this reality theatre that Joe was talking about, the REM state reality theatre. And we had to be able to access it whilst keeping part of our mind conscious. So we had to be able to use the reality theatre. We use that, for example, we can say daydreaming is accessing it, but problem solving is accessing it. Because what you have to be to problem solve is a little bit psychotic. You have to go into your imagination and imagine things that aren't there to solve problems. You also have to be a touch obsessive if you're really going to turn that into something that doesn't exist yet. You've got to concentrate, really concentrate, to, for example, produce all those beads. The average person today would not sit down for 3,000 hours to carve 3,000 little mammoth beads unless they were on the autistic spectrum. And a huge they would need, someone would be in the human race who are visionaries and daydreaming and seeing things, a little bit psychotic, and others would be taking instructions and doing things. And some people would have that mix in them. Some individuals would be a bit psychotic and a bit autistic as well, and they'd be the highly creative ones. And in those times, those people, from the ordinary mass of humanity in those days, would have been regarded as special, because they were innovating, they were creative, and everyone would start copying what they did. So that was why there was an explosion of brilliant tool making. It's because the pioneers that sort of learned how to do these new things, or learned how to paint and so on, other people were sort of trying to learn how they did it, and they'd learn by association with them and picking it up, almost like an apprenticeship system in those days. And very, very rapidly, huge advances went around the human race from that time, but they'd accessed the REM state reality generator. That's what they'd done. And from that, the whole of civilization arose. But without that touch of autism and that touch of psychoticism, you wouldn't have it. It just wouldn't be there. So the extreme cases of autism and the extreme cases of schizophrenia, psychoticism, are really, they could be said to be the casualties of evolution. It's almost as if the universe needs to produce creatures that can step out of time and look at things differently, not just be stuck in the now. Does that make sense? About 12,000, 13,000 years ago, bearing in mind that Stonehenge is only about 5,000 years old, and the pyramids about 4,500 years old, they discovered in 1994 a place called Gobekli Tepe. How many of you have heard of Gobekli Tepe? One or two or three of you. It's the most amazing discovery. It's completely turned upside down our understanding of the history of evolution of civilization. It used to be thought, up until very recently, that what happened was, we were all hunter-gatherers, and then farming evolved. And with farming, we could settle down and create villages and towns and buildings. And from that, you had to organise people in communities. You got the origins of civilization. This particular discovery seems to have turned that on its head, because Gobekli Tepe is a collection of temples. This is just one of them here. And these stones in these temples weigh many, many tons, like the ones at Stonehenge. Some of them are 25 tons, things like that. And they've been moved from one place to another place. They've been carved. They were clearly symbolic in the way that they've all been arranged in a certain sort of, like a temple. And they were created, there's one with a carving on. They were created by people who were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. There's no evidence that there was any farming going on at that time. It started about 1,000 years later, the farming. The growing of wheat and all that sort of thing, and deliberate developing of agriculture, 1,000 or 2 years after Gobekli Tepe. The strange thing is, when farming got going, these amazing places, there's reconstruction, that's the temple we've just been looking at. They've seen that from aerial photographs, there's quite a whole group of temples up on top of this hill. And they found some in other parts of Turkey, where this comes from now too. So this same sort of thing was going on 12,500 years ago. So what was driving this? It wasn't the fact that people were coming together to farm. People were being inspired to come together by individuals who had a vision. So in a sense, you could say there was sort of mystical imperatives that were making people come together, because hunter-gatherers are notoriously individualistic. They share very well. They kill an animal, bring it back to the camp, and the whole family, the whole group shares it. So they had kind of that kind of culture. But why would they go and? It's hard work, carving out and carrying rocks, and you need to organise people. It's as if there were people then who had this inspiration that, you know, if human beings are going to develop, they've got to do things differently than just be hunter-gatherers. And these projects inspire people for whatever reason. We don't know. There's guesses, but we don't really know. But a really strange thing has happened about 2,000 years after these were built. They were all buried deliberately under thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of earth and sand. Now, isn't that strange? That's why they're so well preserved. No one knows why that happened, but clearly there were some individuals who thought it was important to do that. And it was after that that agriculture really got going. Have you ever tried to wheel a wheel of mud, sand in a wheelbarrow? It's jolly heavy, jolly hard work. That is a massive project. Just burying the thing is a massive project. So the human evolution over the last 40,000 years has come about because we've accessed this reality generator, and we've sought greater meaning from the environment and our interaction with it. This temple is about meaning. It's about connection. Now, we don't know exactly what their beliefs were at all. Well, we don't know anything about their beliefs, really. It's just all speculation. But clearly something was going on to do with vision that motivated people who didn't need to put in a lot of effort. And that would have come from a small group of people who understood that this was necessary for the human race, probably. I would speculate. So, talk about the expectation fulfillment theory of dreams. Can you see why we go on about this? And that's why we wrote that Godhead book, is to explore these ideas. Now, the history of science shows that any theory that is true will turn out to have practical applications in the real world. That is just a given, if you like. If it's not true, it just doesn't work. Like Freudian psychoanalytical theory, it just doesn't get people better. People can get little benefits from it. They can get their attention needs met from seeing a psychoanalyst. They can get some insights, perhaps. But if you go along to somebody like that with depression, you will not leave after 2 or 3 sessions with your depression lifted. Because the basic fundamental organising idea of psychoanalytical therapy is not big enough. You know, if you think, if you're thinking about how the world works, means, oh, you've just got to buy these crystals in a crystal shop, and you go along and you put it on top of your television set, and that'll mend it. The idea is not right, is it? And I've met somebody who's done that and thinks that that's how you do it. You know, she's read some silly book and she's going around putting crystals on everything to get a better reception. It doesn't work. So, the importance of REM state research. So this idea then has to have practical applications, this theory, and it does. It shows us to some considerable degree how evolutionary processes work. We know that templates in our biology are formed in the REM state. Instincts, as Michel Jouvet first suggested, it must be to do with the laying down of instincts. And indeed it is. And we know that evolutionary progress in our own lives, our own sort of self-development, self-evolution, but also for the whole of the living world, is to do with metaphorical pattern matching. What's this like? So there's something inside us always seeking a pattern match. Always. So there must be, if a new form of life, a more advanced form of life appears, there must be a pattern match in it. In that form of life that's trying to bring about its potential all the time. So, the other thing about it is it has to be metaphorical. If your brain was to have an exact representation of all the possible pattern matches you were going to make in your life, I mean, it would need to be bigger than this room if it had to be exact. It's just not possible. The only way you can carry information about all the things that's going to happen to you or could happen to you is if you do it metaphorically. It's a bit like this. And that's why when you're teaching children or teaching anybody anything, something they don't know, you connect up to something they do know and you say, well, it's a bit like this, and then you add the extra information in it. Because they've got a pattern in them, that can expand. And then they can take on board and internalise the new knowledge. It tells us something about autism and also why some people are born autistic. The ability to read context is not there in some people. We've seen examples of that this week in the patients that we've had. Certain genetic templates weren't programmed in properly. There's a huge range, as we know, from severely autistic people who don't even have language and who are just content to spin and bang and paddle in water. They're very keen on water, as you know, most of them. It explains how and why we think metaphorically. It's an intrinsic part of the way we understand everything. I think I've just said all that. But we also know that we make mistakes. A metaphor isn't a truth as such, it's a fluid thing. People can operate out of the wrong metaphors. So it's not something that we should say, oh, that's a metaphor, as if a metaphor is truth. It can indicate a truth, just as myths indicate truth. When they're appropriate. But they are not the truth in themselves. The truth is something beyond the myth. But you need myths and metaphors to operate from. That's because that's how the brain works. So the cultural myth of our culture is science, for example. The myth that, if you keep breaking things down and breaking things down and breaking things down, you'll eventually understand the whole. That is not healthy. It's not healthy because we're getting away from the idea that everything actually becomes one, ultimately. But that is the way our culture works now. It tells us how the unconscious mind works. It's working not by repression of instincts, as we were talking about this morning, earlier, Joe was, which is what a lot of people still believe, because of the power of the humanities in universities that really still promotes Freud and Jung and all these ideas as if they're somehow profound, more profound than more recent ideas. It actually works by pattern matching. So we talk about the APET model in Human Givens Psychotherapy. So stuff happens, which is the activating agent, and the brain pattern matches to it, first and foremost. And every pattern match is tagged with an emotion, which is the E in APET. And we sometimes think about things, but most of our thinking is not really thinking, it's association thinking, rumination, one sort or another. So it helps us understand consciousness. We now have a new way to understand consciousness, which is what the online course about consciousness is about. And that explanation actually goes beyond our consciousness and animal consciousness to actually make us realise that because everything in the universe is busy pattern matching, you can't have water, for example, without oxygen and hydrogen pattern matching to say, come together like this, we've got water. That's a pattern match. And in a sense, a pattern match is what consciousness is. So it was the dream theory that made us realise that the whole universe, in a sense, is conscious and must have a sort of mind. It shows how dreams help us stay effective. The mechanism of dreaming that Joe unravelled what it's doing for animals and us, keeps us sane. It preserves our instincts. It allows us to wake up the next day less obsessed with the arousals from the previous day, the unacted out emotional arousals. So it's preserving the integrity of genetic endowment, and also optimizes the use of our rational mind, which clearly nature wants us to be rational some of the time, because what makes us absolutely amazing is this balance between the ability to make a coherent model of reality, which is very much a left brain activation, and have access to creativity and insights and empathy and so on, which is much more a right brain thing. We need that balance between the two. More than any other theory of depression, it explains what depression is. The worrying is an emotional arousal. If you worry, you're getting emotionally aroused. People who worry but don't take action on their worries will dream about that worry that night, metaphorically. And if you do a lot more dreaming sleep, dream REM sleep, than you do slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is recuperative. It refreshes the neurons in the brain with sugars. The immune system's boosted. The cells in the body are mended during slow wave sleep. But in REM sleep, in dream sleep, the brain's burning off energy. So that's why we do less REM sleep. About a quarter at the most of a normal person's sleep time is spent in REM, and the rest of the time is in slow wave recuperative sleep. But if that balance is disturbed, and you're doing a lot more REM sleep and a lot less of recuperative sleep, what happens? Wake up tired. All depressed people wake up tired. And when you explain this to people who are depressed, they know it's true. So it's a hugely therapeutic thing to do. We call it psychoeducation or whatever, to explain to people what's going on. If you stop the worrying, your depression will lift. And that's why we get results in treating depression 3 times quicker than the normal way it's treated by the NHS. And that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal now. It also explains how false memories of abuse can be created by therapists and psychoanalysts and psychiatrists. If you are troubled by something, say bulimia or depression or whatever, and you go along to a psychologist or psychotherapist who says to you, or raises the subject, or perhaps you were abused, you're very anxious, perhaps you were abused when you were a child, just raises the subject, not saying you were even, but what are you going to do about that? You're going to ruminate, aren't you? You're going to think, well, perhaps, I never liked my Uncle Jack, perhaps he abused me. And then, of course, we can create false memories from that very easily. All the research into the creation of memories shows that the easiest thing in the world to do is to create false memories with children and adults. And that's exactly what happens, because somebody goes back to the therapist a week later and says, well, you raised that whole point. Perhaps this is all due to the fact that I was abused, which is there was kind of a fashion for it in the 60s, 70s and 80s, writing books like The Courage to Heal. Evil books, really. It really did an enormous amount of damage because people were reading them and then fantasizing about whether they were abused or not, which is why it's very difficult, to take as gospel when somebody says to you, I was abused. You say, well, how do you know this? Oh, well, it came out in my therapy. That should set off alarm bells in you. Because most people who were really abused, they know. They may have not want to think about it. They may have not thought about it for years. But if you ask them, they'll be able to tell you quite clearly what happened if it was a traumatic, real piece of rape or something. So they go back to the therapist and they say, the funny thing is I had a dream. I had a dream about, and it's, you know, a metaphorical dream about being abused. And then the therapist says something like, that shows that now you're in a nice safe environment here with me, we can explore these issues. Before you know where you are, there's a whole scenario built up. And some people have ended up in prison being falsely accused on the say-so of a psychotherapist and a patient. We exposed some of this back in 15 or more years ago, when this was going on. We put the first big conference on in London at the Royal Society of Medicine on forced memory syndrome, and got to hear some amazing stories as a result. One in particular struck me. This woman had accused the extended male members of her family of ritually abusing her, and when she was a little girl, and raping her endlessly. When the police surgeons examined her, she was still a virgin. She still carried on with the belief, and so did her psychotherapist. They ignored the evidence. But people can end up in prison as a result of those misunderstandings. It's only if you understand what goes on in dreams and about its ruminating and worrying and so on that can cause a lot of dreams. But as Joe said this morning, if you're really excited about going on holiday on Sunday, you could have an exciting, lovely dream about warm beaches and getting away from it all on Sunday. That's a happy dream. All dreams are not nightmares at all. It's to do with expectations. They can be good expectations, or they can be sad. They can be terrifying expectations. It doesn't matter. It's expectations is the common denominator. So it also gives us some ideas about what's happening when we go neurotic. Many neurotic symptoms are due to an inappropriate triggering off of REM state programming. So, for example, we get PTSD, subthreshold traumas. And if the brain's a pattern matching organ, if you've been in, say, a car crash, and it was terrible, perhaps people were killed and so on, flames and burning vehicles and all that sort of thing, this happens to some people, later the brain will pattern match to just the sound of a screeching brake, or a car accelerating or coming to a sudden halt, and you'll have a panic attack because your brain can't distinguish between something that actually happened and some small element of the traumatic genuine event. Can't make that distinguish. So it fires on the full fight or flight response. Even if you're sitting indoors and something's, screeching brakes outside, you can get all agitated. The most interesting little example of that, there was a guy who was absolutely traumatized by Mars bar wrappers. And what happened was, he'd be walking down the street and there'd be a Mars bar wrapper in the gutter and he'd have a panic attack. And it really affected his life. Because there's advert, you can't get away from Mars bar wrappers. They're on advertising hoardings, they're offered for you in the supermarkets, so they're everywhere. Well, he thought they were, because, every time he saw one, he was in a terrible state. His story is this, though. He was on the Falklands. And he was quite badly injured and got onto this little island with burns or whatever was wrong with him. And he staggered behind this rock, and there was another really badly injured man who was just there in a state of shock, stuffing a Mars bar into his mouth. That little piece of information burned into this fellow's limbic system, so that whenever he saw a Mars bar thereafter, a Mars bar wrapper, he had this panic attack. The fight or flight response was switched on. So it's a pattern matching process going on. But it doesn't just go on with traumatic things, it goes on all the time. Every time you go through a door, you're pattern matching to all the other doors you've been through, and you know what you expect the door to do, i.e. open, let you through. But that's a pattern matching process, isn't it? It's not dramatic, we don't take any notice of it, but it is going on all the time. It also helps us know what's happening when we go psychotic. When we're psychotic, we've lost the ability to distinguish the difference between waking reality and dream reality. That's essentially what it is. So, when you have a dream, you wake up in the morning and might be a bit disorientated for a few seconds or so, but very quickly you know, oh, that was a dream. And if it was a nice dream, you think, oh, I was really enjoying that. Or if it was a frightening dream, you think, God, that was only a dream. But within seconds, you reorientate yourself, you go and get dressed, get your breakfast, go off to work or whatever. And you can make that distinction between waking reality and dreaming reality. But with someone who's put under a lot of stress, particularly right-brain creative people, that ability to distinguish waking reality from dream reality, the life in the internal theatre, if you like, breaks down. And their psychosis is, the metaphorical content of their psychosis is very important to them because they're actually living out dreams. And I was talking about this once to a group of psychologists who worked with psychotic patients. And one psychologist said, gosh, this is really interesting, she said. We've been working with a young man who believes he's a vampire. And he comes from a whole family of vampires. He really believes it. And it's disturbing everybody else in the clinic. And he was clearly psychotic. And then she said, but then I got to know more about him and I met his family. It suddenly became clear this was a metaphor for the fact that his family were emotionally and literally thieves. They were a parasitical family. And it's a metaphor for his discomfort about the way his family was. And it made a huge amount of sense to the psychologist because she could see the pattern then. We also know what's going on in hypnosis. The Human Givens theory has the first real definition of what's going on in hypnosis, which has baffled, frightened, intrigued, amused the human race for thousands of years. We know that it is really any hypnotic technique or happening, because all kinds of things can turn you into a trance. But what is happening is that you're accessing the REM state. So hypnosis, when it's done deliberately, whether by a stage hypnosis or a therapist or entertainer or whatever, you're using an artificial means to get the person to access the REM state. So any artificial means of accessing the REM state is what hypnosis is. And that's a clear distinction. You're putting someone in a focused state of attention and you're using artificial means to do that, rather than the person doing it themselves by reading a book and focusing their attention or whatever. Someone else is doing it to you. So, any artificial way of accessing the REM state is hypnosis. We know how to improve psychotherapy outcomes because the more we know about how the brain works, how the brain deals with emotional arousal, and the significance of dreams and so on, we get better results. We can also see and assess other therapies. If other therapists don't have as much information as we do, those therapeutic organising ideas that they have are just not big enough to encompass this knowledge, they're not going to be so effective, and so it proves. Human Givens therapy is shown to be more effective. The research is coming out now and it'll build. It becomes more effective if you internalise the organising ideas. That's how you become an effective therapist or educator or whatever. Is if you really internalise these ideas. Don't try and do it by the book. You have to really understand what's happening in front of you. So, painting by James Marsh, a good friend of mine. Any questions?
Um,